Mao is the biggest destroyer of Chinese culture. It's very, very sad what's happened to this civilization.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Wild Swans author Jung Chang tells us about life in revolutionary China.
Roughly 40 million people died of starvation. And the reason for the famine was Mao was exporting food to Russia and Eastern Europe to exchange for military technologies and equipment for his dream of building China into a superpower.
Jung talks about working 12 years on a world-renowned book about Mao.
We traveled all over the world. We were in dozens of archives in many countries, and we interviewed nearly everybody who had interesting dealings with Mao, including, George Bush the senior, Henry Kissinger, Edward Heath in this country, and many others.
And being the first person from communist China to get a doctorate from a British university.
We were all wearing the Mao suit, and we were not allowed to go out on our own, and we had to move around in a group, and we were quite a sight in the London streets. I was dying to go out on my own and to have fun.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm delighted to be sitting down with historian and author Jung Chang. Jung, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Wild Swans is now in 37 languages. 15 million copies have been sold. I mean, this book opened up China to the world, really. When you released it 32 years ago, did you expect it to have the impact that it did?
No, I didn't. But I knew it was a good book because I wrote it, my own experience, the experience of my family, and I tried to be as truthful as possible. I did some research, and I think it was, I'm extremely pleased, of course, about the way it's received.
So the book follows 3 generations. Your grandma, who was a concubine, had her feet bound, is kind of part of ancient China, really, and then your mother, a revolutionary, and yourself, who experienced the Cultural Revolution. What are the abiding memories of your childhood?
Before the Cultural Revolution, and my memory is that I have a very happy family. My parents never had rows in front of our children, so psychologically I was not damaged. I mean, I had a very happy childhood, and they also they wanted us to excel academically. My father coached us in Chinese language and literature, and my mother was our math teacher. My grandmother brought us up, and my parents wanted us to grow up to be upright and honest. So I think I had good family background.
So you were part of the Red Guard when the Cultural Revolution happened. I think in the West it doesn't really get the attention it deserves. This was a significant thing that happened in history, really. I mean, what was the purpose of the Cultural Revolution, and what did you experience?
Well, I think the thing is, the Red Guard, it's not a specific organization. I dare say virtually everybody of my generation and the generation older were Red Guards. And we were Red Guard because I was only in the Red Guard for a month, less than a month. But we were all keen to join. I was 14 then. We were all keen to join because Mao had asked us to join. Right. The Red Guards were Mao's babies. And Mao launched the Cultural Revolution using the Red Guards as the task force. And why Mao launched the Cultural Revolution, we had to go back for a few years to the time of the Great Leap and the Great Famine. Between 1958 and 1961, roughly 40 million people died of starvation. And the reason for the famine was Mao was exporting food to Russia and Eastern Europe to exchange for military technologies and equipment for his dream of building China into a superpower so he could dominate the world. What did Mao have to pay for those expensive military factories? In those days, China wasn't rich, so Mao's answer was food. So he exported the food which he knew his people were dependent on for survival. Mao's policies were so extreme. I mean, even his number two, President Liu Shaoqi, was against it. And most of the communist officials were against it as well, because they themselves were starving. And so together, at the beginning of 1962, President Liu Shaoqi actually ambushed Mao and got together with the party officials and forced Mao to change his policies. That's why the Great Famine stopped in 1962. And Mao was angry. He hated being outsmarted. He wanted revenge. And the Cultural Revolution was Mao's revenge, particularly against President Liu, who died a painful death during the Cultural Revolution. And the Cultural Revolution was also Mao's great purge, because he could see that his old officials were no longer keen to follow him. And so he wanted to purge them and replace them with other people more loyal to him. And that's why he started the Cultural Revolution, and that's why the Cultural Revolution had the main targets of the Cultural Revolution were actually communist officials, Mao's own party.
So it's a famine, 40 million people died, but this wasn't a natural occurrence. This was this man's choice to do that because he wanted to move forward with his military plans.
Yes. I mean, it wasn't a natural disaster, and that's what President Liu said at this meeting in conference for the party's chief officials at the beginning of 1962. There was very little natural bad weather, and the main thing was human. And the human thing, as Jung and I, my husband, who was the co-author of the biography of Mao, as we discovered, and the human thing was the export, food export. I mean, you know, China never had enough food for its people. From the Qing dynasty, China had been exporting food, had been importing food for its population. And now under Mao, all imports were stopped. And instead, he was exporting food to prop up the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. I mean, for example, East Germany lifted its food ration thanks to Chinese food import. So obviously his people are going to die. And Mao knew this before he started the Great Leap. And he actually said for all his projects to take off, half of China may have to die.
Wow. I wanted to ask you about your father. Your father was a communist sympathizer, and then he turned against them. I think it's hard for us to, in the West, to kind of appreciate the bravery that would be needed in that environment to do that. What happened with your father, and what inspired him to do that?
Well, my father joined the communists when he was a teenager. He thought the communists were going to end injustice and were going to give people a full stomach. And of course, when the Great Famine happened, that was just totally against what he thought the party was going to do. And so he actually wanted to speak up, but he was persuaded out of it because it would be disastrous, not only for himself, but for his family. And so my father then stopped himself and he didn't speak up. But he was very unhappy. He felt very guilty about not speaking up. And so when the Cultural Revolution started, when things became more awful and tens of millions of people became victims and were abused, and killed and committed suicide. And so my father decided to speak up. In those days, there was only one route, that is to write to Mao, to ask Mao to stop his policies. So my father wrote to Mao twice and called on Mao to stop the Cultural Revolution. And of course, as a result, he was arrested, tortured, driven insane. He was subject to numerous those violent denunciation meetings, at which actually, in spite of being beaten up, and he said he does oppose the Cultural Revolution, even if it was launched by Mao, for which he was subject to more abuse. And so eventually he died prematurely.
If we look at Chinese history or the classical novels of China, there's a lot of rebelling that happens. So people feel the leader has lost his way, they rebel and a new dynasty starts. And what did the Chinese Communist Party do to the Chinese people to extinguish this rebellion sense?
Organization. The Chinese Communist Party is a totalitarian party, and it's a Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist organization. And they had achieved what emperors in Chinese history hadn't, which is to organize the whole vast China. For example, in the countryside, for 550 million peasants, they organized them into 26,000 people's communes. And so the communes I worked as a peasant in 2 different communes. I knew that the commune controlled every aspect of a peasant life. So during the famine, in one of the villages I was in, the villagers told me that there was food, but the commune had given orders of not to open the granary without order, even if you die of death. 饿死不开仓. Even if you die of death, you're not allowed to open the granary. And the commune could enforce its policy by the commune militias, and there was also the army. Mao had secured Lin Biao's support at that historical conference in 1962. Lin Biao backed Mao, and he controlled the army, and the army, together with the commune militias, had ran China like a big prison. So it was impossible to have any large-scale organized rebellions. There were individual attempts, but they were soon caught and executed and punished in other ways.
You left China, you won a scholarship to England, so you're leaving this revolutionary China, going to leafy England. It must have been quite a contrast. What did you have to change about yourself to fit into this new society?
I came to Britain in 1978, and the reason was that Mao had died in 1976, so China had begun to change. And in 1978, for the first time in the history of communist China, scholarships for going abroad were awarded on academic basis. And I sat for national exam, I did well, so I got a scholarship to come to Britain. And that was for a year. And after that, I got a scholarship from the University of York. So I stayed on and did a doctorate. And so when I got a doctorate in 1982, China was just beginning to open up wider. So I was the first person from communist China to get a doctorate from a British university. When I arrived in 1978, I came with a group of 14 others, and we were all wearing the Mao suit, and we were not allowed to go out on our own, and we had to move around in a group, and we were quite a sight in the London streets. I was dying to go out on my own and to have fun. So I was, in the first year when I was in London, I spent the whole time trying to figure out ways to go out. And I was perhaps the first person to go into an English pub from the people from China, because we were particularly told that we're not allowed to go into a pub because the Chinese translation for pub is 酒吧, which suggested somewhere indecent, with nude women gyrating. But I was torn with curiosity, of course, and I knew there was a pub across the road from the college, an Ealing College of Higher Education, and today the West London University, I think. Anyway, so one day I sneaked out of the college, I darted across the road, I pushed the door of the pub open, but of course I saw nothing of the kind, only some old man sitting there drinking beer, and I was rather disappointed. So I had a fantastic time when I first came.
You were recently awarded a CBE for your services to literature and history, so congratulations for that.
Thank you.
Your book Mao, that you wrote with your historian husband John Halliday, and Chris Patton talked about this book, Rewriting Modern Chinese History. Why did you want to write this book in particular about Mao?
Well, because I grew up under Mao, and Mao dominated my life. But I felt that I knew very little about him when I was writing Wild Swans, and I had more questions about Mao and his rule. And so after Wild Swans was published, it seemed very natural for me to write a biography of Mao, because writing a biography is the best way to get to know the person. And John was also interested in Mao, so we wrote it together. We spent 12 years of our lives writing about Mao.
What did you do to find the information that isn't in other sources about Mao?
Well, we divided our research by language.
Right.
Because I'm Chinese, so I dealt with the Chinese language sources. And John speaks many languages, so he was landed with the rest of the world. And in particular, he speaks Russian. So he spent a lot of time in the Russian archives, which was a treasure trove, is a treasure trove still. But now John and I have caught a window of opening in the 1990s. In Russia, Yeltsin was in power, and he opened the archives of Russia. So John was able to spend years, working in there, digging out the archive documents. And I was in China, and that was also a golden opportunity. After Tiananmen, there was some sort of a deal between China and America lifted its sanctions on China quite quickly, and China continued to open up. So the 1990s was very liberal. And so I was able to travel all over China, and I was able to interview people who were very close to Mao, the widows of Mao's colleagues, Mao's members of Mao's family, his staff, key officials, main historical witnesses, and they were still alive and were eager to talk. And I was also able to get lots and lots of documents, and those documents were published. So in the 1980s, under Hu Yaobang, all archives, museums in China published the archives in their museums. So there were many volumes of archive documents were published about the Communist Party history. And so in the 1990s, there were just many of them on sale in specialist bookshops. That was also a treasure trove. And so that's why we spent 12 years, because we had to interview all the witnesses and digest all these documents. And of course, we traveled all over the world. We were in dozens of archives in many countries, and we interviewed nearly everybody who had interesting dealings with Mao, including, George Bush the senior, Henry Kissinger, Edward Heath in this country, and many others.
Incredible. So what do you think are the main things people in the West should know about Mao?
I think people should see him as someone who is responsible for the death of over 70 million Chinese in peacetime.
So in the West, we rightly discuss the crimes of Hitler, but the crimes of Mao don't get that much attention. The number of deaths is so high. We could walk down the street and see a student wearing a Mao t-shirt and no one would bat an eyelid. Why do you think the West is so ignorant of the horrific legacy of Mao?
Well, I think under Mao, China was completely closed to the outside world. I mean, I grew up in China for 26 years. I mean, when I was in China, I never saw, the only time I talked to a foreigner was when I was aged 20, in my 20s, in a port in South China, Zhanjiang, where we English language students were sent to practice our English with the sailors. They were our only chance. We were there only for 12 days. We were so keen to talk to them. We would sit, in the sailors' club and grab them as soon as they came on shore. Of course, we had no idea what must be on their minds. And so China was closed. There were no Western journalists and nothing to report what really happened in China to the outside world. Even when China was opening up, I think Mao was also very lucky to have his mouthpieces in both the left and the right. On the left, Edgar Snow in the 1930s gave Mao a glowing report which caught the imagination of actually not only the mainstream West, but also the Chinese, because the Chinese Communist Party then translated Edgar Snow's book and Red Star over China. And when they translated it, they changed the title to Journey to the West. And this influenced many radical young people, including my mother. And one reason why my mother was drawn to the communists was reading Edgar Snow. So the propaganda was very effective. And then in the 1960s, I mean, there were many pro-Mao young people who later became major academics in the area of Mao, and then they eulogized Mao to their students, who continue to eulogize Mao. And then on the right there was Henry Kissinger, who, for his own reasons, I mean, because he was famous largely because of his relationship with Mao and China. I think out of self-interest and out of his fascination, unusual fascination and sympathy for dictators. He said all the nice things about Mao, like Mao was a philosopher, and the Chinese leadership were like monks who would be challenging the morality of Westerners. You know, complete rubbish. I mean, even as late as 2011, when Mao's atrocities had been well known, and Kissinger flew all the way to China to attend a big mass rally of hundreds of thousands of people to sing propaganda songs eulogizing Mao and celebrating the 90th birthday of the Chinese Communist Party. And so with this sort of promotion, which I think none of the other dictators enjoyed in the West, and that unfortunately Mao was probably still by many people not seen in the same league as Hitler and Stalin. It is harmful because the current regime, which is doing its best to promote Mao in their effort to drag China into the bad old Maoist days, they could quote Westerners, Western academics, Western so-called China experts, to cast doubt on people's own experiences and people like myself, my experience, my books, and to kind of cast out on these and many other people's personal experiences, to make things very easy for the current regime to keep the Chinese people ignorant about Mao.
So Mao oversaw the destruction of the aristocracy of China, really, and so many kind of special buildings, antiques, traditions were all lost. What did this loss of the culture do to the Chinese nation?
Well, it's a very, very sad thing to see the disappearance of the visible signs of the Chinese culture. I mean, I saw so much destruction even in my lifetime. I mean, my school, which was founded in 141 BC, was the first public school, meaning a school funded by the local government in China. The oldest. And so there were many antiques when I was a student there from 1964. I mean, in the Cultural Revolution in 1966, I saw these things being destroyed. There were many little sandstone statues on little dainty bridges across a brook that went across my school. And the boys just went around with the hammers and iron rods and knock at the statues. And because Mao had called on the young people to smash the old culture. And of course, that, I think, brutalized at least a whole generation of the Chinese, and through them, when they grew up, with the young generation, through them, the young generation then didn't receive proper, don't still receive proper education about Chinese culture. And quite frankly, I think Mao is the biggest destroyer of Chinese culture. It's very, very sad what's happened to this civilization.
The supporters of the Chinese regime would call you anti-China for writing these books. I mean, what would you say to that?
I think that's utterly ridiculous, because I didn't destroy a single cultural element in China, and it's the party, it's Mao. And it's probably these people who claim to be patriots who have destroyed the Chinese culture.
I mean, you've done more than most to expose the crimes of the Chinese Communist Party. Have you ever felt unsafe or felt threats to your safety?
Well, definitely, but I mean, that is a professional hazard. So, I mean, when I have got into the research of Mao, the biography, and when I realized, when I saw these things we dug out, and then I realized this is dangerous, and I made up my mind, I just have to cast all that behind me and not to think about it, and just to do what I think is the right thing to do.
Jung Chang, thanks for joining us.
Okay, thank you.